Hi there, my name is Craig Smith from Minerva Elite Performance. Today we're joined by Andrew from PurpleCV and we are looking at a series called Joining Civvy Street, Top Career Tips, Now You're Getting Out. My name is Craig Smith and I'm the Head of Education here at Minerva Elite Performance, and my colleague joining me today is...
My name is Andrew, and like Craig said, I'm from PurpleCV. I'm the founder and director for PurpleCV, which has been around for 12, 13 years. And we're all about making sure you present your impact as effectively as possible on your CV. So delighted to be here today.
Brilliant. So, within this particular topic, we're looking at general CV advice for military personnel and the wider workforce. Andrew, got some interesting questions for you on this one, because in my role in education, I come across a lot of military personnel who are transitioning or in the resettlement process of getting out the military. And this whole world of CV writing, how to sell themselves, is a minefield for them. So I suppose really my first question is the what? What makes a strong modern CV, Andrew?
Well, there's lots of tips, but I think we're going to go through some of those top tips today. And I think probably the top tip that I'm going to start with is ensuring that your CV is tailored. So many people nowadays will just put one generic CV together and fire it off to lots of different jobs that they come across. And the problem is with this, it's not tailored. So when a recruiter looks at a CV, they're also going to look at the job spec that you've gone for. And what they want to see is a synergy between the two. And if they don't see that synergy, they're not going to give you a call. And then there's other aspects to it as well, such as ATS systems, which I'm sure we'll go through at some point. But having a tailored CV is critical. It's going to show that you have a passion for that role that you've applied for. And the way that we tailor that CV is doing things like making sure that the terminology from that job spec is translated into your CV where possible. And we achieve that by picking up on keywords and things like this that we need to embed within your CV. So probably a top tip is to ensure that your CV is tailored. Now, obviously, when it comes to, why we're here today, which is helping people who are ex-military, there's a few more important aspects as well that are pretty important. So things such as acronyms, terminology, but I know that we're going to talk about that elsewhere in the series. But top tip from me is to ensure that your CV is tailored.
Thank you. So one of the things that I often hear, and it'd be great if you could elaborate what this means to you, is, when CVs are designed around impact, not just tasks. So from my experience, working with lots of veterans, is they're very good at kind of like downplaying quite impressive elements of what they do and just talk about tasks, where in actual fact, what's the impact? What do we mean when we say that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question, and something that many people miss out on. So, imagine as an employer, you receive a CV or an application. Anybody can list the tasks that you've done throughout your career, but what employers want to look for is someone who's going to go above and beyond, or at the very least, be able to quantify their value within that organization. And that's a critical word, is value.
Mm,
So, an employer, when they employ someone, they want to know what they're going to get for their pounds and pennies if you were to join that organization. And the way that we can demonstrate that on our CV is by being objective and being quantifiable.
yeah,
So, saying that you lead a team is one thing, but saying you lead a team of 50 is another.
yeah.
It gives scale. So when we talk about impact, this is what we're talking about. It's not only, making sure that our responsibilities have some form of scale, but also showing our achievements as well. Achievements are critical, just like tailoring your CV, because it shows, once again, how you go above and beyond in your capacity as an employee.
Yeah, and I think that's quite an interesting element, and that's one of the things I try and say to some of the individuals I meet is, the so what. If I'm reading your CV, if you're just telling me information, then it's very black and white. If I have to fill in too many gaps for myself, that the onus is on me as the reader. Then you should be filling those gaps out for me and making it clear. And the impact element is something I think a lot of military people, when they're getting out, if you've been in a certain rank in a certain role at a certain camp, well, 100 people have left that rank in that station, in that role. So how are you different? And I think you're right there, what you're saying. If you can create the impact in your CV, that really does pay dividends for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the end of the day, if we're applying within the civilian world, particularly within the private sector, the one thing that's going to talk on your CV is pounds and pennies. So if any capacity that you've had within the army or within the military, I should say, has any element of commercials, then be sure to include that. It may be that you reduce costs as a result of embedding a particular process or an improved process. And that is easily transferable and translatable to any prospective employer. Another tip for you there.
Well, I've got to be honest, and I'll say this to any listeners, I've never met a demographic like military personnel who undersell themselves so much on paper. When you actually speak to them, dig in, and you're like, whoa, that's pretty impressive, but your CV does not read like that, and it's about that impact element. So if you were giving someone some top tips, like very practical top tips to improve their CV immediately, what would be like the top sort of 3 things you would say, like do this, this, and this?
So I think, first of all, tailoring the CV, but we've already spoken about that.
Yeah.
Focus on achievements rather than responsibilities. Responsibilities are important to put on your CV, but it shouldn't dominate your CV. It should start with action verbs, it should start with scale, and should end with the achievement of your responsibility. Using a consistent structure throughout. So, the layout of your CV is pretty important. We want the CV to be easily read. So picking the right layout, picking the right format, the right typeface, everything like this should be well considered. We want the ability of the reader to be able to glance at your CV and immediately be attracted to it as a direct result of the layout. And we want to make sure it's consistent throughout. So we want to make sure throughout our experience, if we're listing a particular role, such as putting the date, putting our job title, and putting who you worked for, make sure that we use that same layout for all of your subsequent roles. Because again, this is going to allow the reader to be able to glance at your CV and easily understand and easily digest your career to date. And particularly important with ex-military is using plain English. And I know possibly we'll talk about this later on in the series, but we need to understand, if we're applying to the private sector or within the Civvy Street, the acronyms that you're using and the terminology may not be understood. So we want to make sure that we consider that and translate it where possible. And again, another really important point for ex-military is transferable skills. So we want to make sure that those skills that you've picked up within the military, whether it's leadership, critical thinking, problem solving, are all translated nicely within your content. And then obviously there's the easy ones in terms of making sure there's no spelling, no grammar mistakes. This is pretty important as well.
Yeah. Well, I've got 2 questions that are burning because I've always wanted to ask a specialist these 2 questions, and it's linked to this. One, is there a maximum page count for a CV? Because there's rumour mills around that should never be more than 2 sides of A4. Then there was that European kind of like template thing that came out that Canva gives you a template that you can use.
Yeah, the Europass.
Any feelings around those 2 questions?
So as with many things in CV writing, in my opinion, there's no right or wrong answer for many aspects of a CV. So the most critical thing is to make sure whatever the page count, that the content within that CV is relevant. Providing the content is relevant to the job that you want to go for, then in my opinion, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 2 or possibly even 3. However, the other aspect to this is the general norms within recruitment. So many people will swear blind and say, look, it must be a maximum of 2 pages. And these are norms that we have to consider because there are recruiters out there who say, look, if it's any more than 2 pages, this is indicative of possibly an individual who is unable to write succinctly or put information across in a manner which is over the course of 2 pages. So no right or wrong answer, but if we need to make sure that the content all of that content is relevant to the role that you're going for. If you go for more than 2 pages, you need to make sure that exactly that rule applies. That is extremely relevant. Generally speaking, within the UK, 2 pages is the norm. Just another quick tip there as well. If you go for 2 pages, then don't go for 1.5. There's a lot of white space on there that we could be using. So if you go for 2, use the full 2 pages. If you go for 1 page, try and make sure that the content is not too condensed, because again, we want to make sure that the reader is easily able to digest. So if you're using, font size 8 is not recommended. Go for font size 10 or 11 or even 12. But again, we need to make sure that all of the content is relevant. But in the UK, 1 to 2 pages is the norm. If you go for 3 pages, this is typically for senior leadership positions. So yeah, it's pretty normal that if you're in a senior leadership position, that 3 pages is normal, but certainly no more than 3.
And I know we ask these questions and we think they're such obvious things, but they're really not. Like when you speak to people, especially in the military, they may have been in for 22 years and haven't written a CV. They joined when they were 16, and they've been in the military, and then they're getting out, and all of a sudden they've got to write this thing called a CV. So even tips of this nature, in terms of how big it should be, what should be on it, it gives people a real confidence that they're on the right track. So Andrew, thank you so much for those top tips. That's really helpful.
You're welcome.
Next, we're talking about translating military terminology and acronyms for civilian employers. Are you speaking a language that civilian organizations can understand?